All right, so first off, I'd like to thank you for all coming. In case if any of you don't know or have never been here, the town of Arlington and Belmont and the city of Cambridge meet every other month for an ABC flood group advisory meeting, and where we try to tackle issues and address issues relating to flooding. It's usually, we don't have anybody coming to visit our meetings, so we don't usually have a presentation, but I think it's something we want to do in the future because the turnout was pretty good. So this presentation, I think, is a lot of people are interested in it. It really comes down to sea level rise and climate change. So I'd like to introduce Julie Wormser, who is Vice President at the Boston Harbor now. And if I could just ask you to give a little description of yourself, but also how Boston Harbor now became what it was before, and then I'll just let you move straight into the...
So my name's Julie Wormser. I actually live just down the road in North Cambridge, but I apologize for being late. The T windows were really dirty, and I couldn't look out, and I said, "White church, ah!" And I got off at the, is it Baptist church? So, but I'm the Vice President for Policy and Planning at Boston Harbor now. Which just actually started in April.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
It was the merger between two older nonprofits, one called Boston Harbor Association, which I was the executive director of. We worked for 40 years to clean up Boston Harbor and establish the 43-mile-long Boston Harbor Walk, which allows you to go all the way from Milton to Winthrop, as long as you want to swim the Mystic along the way. And then our friends at the Boston Harbor Island Alliance were the nonprofit partner of the Boston Harbor Islands National Park and help create visitor centers and get people out on the ferries and concessions. So if you haven't spent much time on Boston's waterfront and the islands, particularly for us who've been around for a while when Boston Harbor was really dirty, it's transformed. It's really worth a visit, as is the Mystic River. So when we officially said goodbye to the Boston Harbor cleanup, which was really only this spring, but more so in 2011, we thought, okay, do we fold or do we evolve? And we realized at the time that the next big policy concern was sea level rise. And so what I'm going to give to you today is based on our research from all over the world to say, what is Boston facing in terms of climate threats? And then what have other cities done about it with similar threats? So Boston is certainly, for sure, far more vulnerable than Arlington to sea level rise. Here it's much more about street flooding and river flooding. So I mentioned this about Boston Harbor now. So Superstorm Sandy was the largest storm to hit the east coast of the United States in recorded history. Most hurricanes are 300 miles long. This was 1,000 miles long. And then what made it a superstorm is it ran into a nor'easter, which is why it all of a sudden veered to the west and made landfall at New York and New Jersey. And where it did hit, it wreaked havoc with our transportation systems, cultural icons, electrical grid. But does anybody know what that building is? Goldman Sachs. So they were the only ones who put their generator above their basement. And then our residential areas. But this is what Boston looked like the day of Hurricane Sandy. This is what it looks like when we have a high tide plus 2.5 foot flood. If you're in this picture and could look left, that's where the aquarium is. So this is Long Wharf. Right in front of you is the Custom House Tower and Marriott Long Wharf Hotel. So why so different? It's not just a matter of luck. It's really a combination of things. Before I started thinking about sea level rise, I thought, oh, my poor theoretical grandchildren, and our daughter's 13, so that's some time from now, knock on wood, what they'll have to deal with one day when we have coastal flooding. But really, this is not about like a switch turning on sometime 100 years from now. It's about increased probability of more and more flooding, more frequent and deeper. So here's the three pieces that go together, and then we'll talk about how that conflates in Boston. So the first piece is storm surges, and our weather comes from the east. in this part of the world. So nor'easters, meaning it comes from the northeast. And all of that wind force with the storm pushes water in front of it. So when you're standing on the coast, there's nowhere for that water to go up once it hits the coast. So we experience the ocean as relatively higher during a storm surge. And a normal nor'easter storm surge might be 2 to 4 feet. What we call a 100-year, quote-unquote, storm surge is 5 feet. And then our very scientific term is called wicked high tide. And a wicked high tide is when the sun and the moon align during full moons and new moons. Anybody remember vector geometry from high school? When two things are pulling in the same direction, they have additional force. So a couple times a month, our tides might be 1 or 2 feet higher. We were calling them wicked pissa high tides once a year when you're actually the moon's closest at the full moon, but people got offended. So we stopped calling them wicked pissa. But that's also called the king tide, if you've heard of that. And that actually happened 3 times this year, and that caused flooding with 2.5 feet of higher high tide, and that's actually similar to what we got during Hurricane Sandy. And then underlying sea level rise. And the way these converge, I think about as a little kid in a bathtub. So imagine if you have a predictably tantrumy child. You will be flood prepared by only putting a little bit of water in your bathtub. If you have a predictably extremely calm child, you can fill up your bathtub all the way to the top without fear of coastal flooding. But watch that tantrumy child in a full bathtub and you will get coastal flooding. So similarly, in terms of storms and sea level rise, it's really the higher our underlying sea level, the smaller and smaller the storm needs to be to overtop our seawalls. So there's a relationship. So let's look at those in turn. So the distance between Boston and New York, as the crow flies, is only about 200 miles, but we have an enormous difference in topography. Not to be partisan, but our harbor's much better than New York's. So first of all, it's hard to see with the light on, and I wonder, do all of the lights, is it really loud? Thank you. I'm glad to not have that in my armpit. Do all of the lights include this one, or can we turn just that one off?
I think we can turn that one if you want.
If we could turn just this one off, you would see better. Is that better for folks?
Okay.
Okay. So what you can see now that there's less light is that there's a major mountain range underwater called Stellwagen Bank. And if you've ever gone whale watching, that's where the whales hang out. It's an incredibly rich marine environment. It also, remember our storms come from the east, it knocks out storm energy between Massachusetts Bay and Boston Harbor. And then looking at Boston Harbor proper, there's Winthrop to the north, Hull to the south, and 34 harbor islands. So by the time a major wave, and this is what you would think of as has a 1 in 100 chance of hitting any given year. We call it a 100-year wave, but that assumes a static environment. So now we really call it a 1 in 100 chance per year. That's a 30-foot wave. By the time that hits the aquarium and it makes its way all the way through all our islands, it's a 2-foot wave. The other thing is that Boston Harbor is almost a full circle, so all of that storm energy is really good at dissipating. So we don't get giant storm surges. The difference between a normal storm surge and a 1,000-year storm surge is about 3.5 feet. It's not that big of a deal compared to New York City. And really, this is about topography. So first of all, New York is to the west of Long Island Sound. So all of that the wind and wave gets pushed down to the north of Long Island, down the East River. The other half of the storm gets pushed south of Long Island, up New York Harbor, which itself is very narrow and almost no islands. So it's 2 funnels of water. So as a result, in that difference in topography, the stronger the storm, we really max out at 6 feet of a storm surge. The stronger the storm, the higher the storm surge. And Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, was about a 500-year storm for them. But for us, our 1,000-year storm storm surge is about 2 feet lower than New York City's. So the difference in topography makes an enormous difference. The next thing is tides, and we took this picture. We actually did crowdsourcing. I don't know if anybody saw that. We in the aquarium, the Museum of Science, got together and did crowdsourcing of photographs up and down the Massachusetts coast during the king tide in October. This is where General Electric's, so this is no wind, no storms, sunny day. This is where General Electric is going to put its new global headquarters, right? And it's starting with being at sea level during these wicked high tides. Here's the Harbor Walk in Dorchester. Look at where the bench is. Here's a playground, obviously not supposed to be a water park. This is the barking crab next to the Tea Party Museum and the Children's Museum. This is the Harbor Walk. It's obviously not meant to be submerged. This is Long Wharf. It's at sea level. This is one of the islands, George's Island. Typically that's the pier. It's typically much lower. Here's our road salt in East Boston and Chelsea. This is, again, Long Wharf. That water actually came up through a storm drain. So that's one of the things that will actually push floodwater inland, is that it backs up through storm drains when the water's too high. Fort Point Channel, where the Children's Museum is, the Tea Party Ships Museum. Here's a restaurant that's in the water in the north end. This is the dry dock in Charlestown Navy Yard, and it's just absolutely up to the gills, and the entire Navy Yard is that level. So the tides make a big difference in flooding as well. This is the Coast Guard station in Lower Manhattan, and this is what they saw the day of Superstorm Sandy. So this lowest, let me see if I can get a mouse going. So this lowest wave at the bottom, that's the astronomical tide, just high tide, low tide, twice daily cycle. That you can predict out for 1,000 years. That's just based on the sun and the moon. Then this green line in the middle is Superstorm Sandy's storm surge. So it unfortunately peaked at high tide. That horizontal purple line is the highest astronomical tide of the year, or what we call king tide. And unfortunately, tide plus storm surge is additive. So that really high curve at the top is the storm tide. So New York during Sandy experienced a storm tide that was 10 feet higher than normal high tide. And that's why it was so catastrophic. Let's look at Boston. Here's our Coast Guard station and its tide gauge. If you're standing at the Children's Museum and looking across the way, you will see this. And this is what that tide gauge saw the day of Hurricane Sandy. So first of all, remember, we have all these barriers in the way of our storm surge. So our storm surge was much lower. It's about 4.5 feet instead of 10 feet, not just because of the distance of the epicenter, but because of our topography. But it also peaked close to low tide. Had it peaked at high tide, we would have had a 100-year storm, which we've really only had twice in 200 years, the blizzard of 78 and once in the 1800s. So we had a 5.5-hour miss of another major flood like that. But because it landed at low tide, we saw almost no flooding. You know, just one of these nuisance tides as we saw multiple times this year. The other thing you see about this curve, you can just visually see, is New York's tide cycle is only 4 feet between high and low tide. Yeah. Remember that our maximum storm surge is only 6 feet. Our tide cycle is 10 feet. So only if you get a storm surge maxing out above mid-tide do you even care, right? So we have this combination of a very protective harbor and actually a very protective tide cycle. That's what makes Boston and New York so different. So when people say, if Sandy had happened here, it wouldn't have happened in the same way. But here's the dun-dun-dun part of the presentation, and why I am here with you tonight, is sea level rise. Now, this graph comes from Climate Ready Boston. It was just released in December, hot off the press. And what it shows, the reason there's 2 different colors on this graph, is the amount of sea level rise we'll have by the end of the century is dramatically influenced by global carbon emissions, which is beyond our control, but we can help. So if we, as a worldwide community, switch to bicycles, not cars, stairs, not elevators, we can get down to 2.5 feet of sea level rise in Boston. If we do moderately well, you know, gas cars, electric cars, kinds of things, a lot more solar, and versus if we do nothing, we'll have somewhere in the range between 2.5 feet and 7.5 feet of sea level rise by the turn of the century. The question is, why do we care about those numbers? Because a third of Boston would flood at high tide once we have 7.5 feet of sea level rise. So the fact that that could come as soon as the end of the century is very stark. This is what high tide plus 7.5 feet looks like of flooding in Boston. Anywhere there is a color, the deeper the color, the deeper the flooding. But anywhere there's a color says that there is saltwater flooding at high tide with 7.5 feet of sea level rise. I'm going to show you why this map looks like it does. I'm going to overlay the map of 1775, right? Before we started filling in our shallow bays. You ready? Yeah. There's the mystery solved, right? I'm just going to do it again. So our seafaring ancestors knew full well just how high the storm surges were, just how high the tide cycle was. They filled in all our salt marshes and shallow bays with horses and shovels. It was hard work. They never contemplated sea level rise. So we are left with this challenge of the fact that a third of Boston is pretty immediately, at least in geological or political terms, at risk of flooding. Really, once we have 2 feet of sea level rise, all of those filled lands are within our 100-year tide zone, or 1 in 100 chance of flooding in a given year. So what we're seeing today is this chronic flooding. So this is what it looks like when we have flooding 2.5 feet above today's high tide. That's what we saw in those photos. That's what we saw during Superstorm Sandy. Even that amount of flooding is getting more common. In 1920, this was happening about once every 2 years. Between 1970 and 2010, it happened about 3 times every 2 years, so it was tripled. Now we're seeing it a half a dozen times a year. So it's starting. You know, that basically the amount of sea level rise we've already seen, which is a little over a foot since the Industrial Revolution, is starting to overtop our infrastructure. This is how much flooding would have happened had Superstorm Sandy peaked at high tide instead of low tide. It just shows you how flat Boston is, how close we are to high tide. So the amount that floods today in what we consider our flood zone today, and where people have to get flood insurance, that's 7% of Boston. That's considered our current 100-year flood. And again, that's a misleading term. You really say it's a 1 in 100 chance this year flood, because now things are moving. With 2 feet of sea level rise, which could happen as soon as mid-century, that becomes our annual flood. With 5 feet of sea level rise, which isn't even the maximum that's predicted, that's our twice daily high tide. So what floods in this area? This is what former, or now the late Mayor Menino dubbed the Innovation District. We've been calling it the Inundation District because it's the first thing to flood. And this is where there's billions of dollars of new development. Bayside Expo, which is UMass Boston, just purchased for new buildings. If you use a Gillette razor, it was made at the Gillette World Shaving Headquarters in Fort Point Channel in South Boston. The U.S.'s Constitution in the Charlestown Navy Yard. The Constitution floats, but the Navy Yard doesn't, obviously. And then if you ever go to Faneuil Hall, in between City Hall and Faneuil Hall, you'll see an etching along the ground. That's the original shoreline of Boston. So high tide plus 5 feet brings us all the way through Faneuil Hall and Quincy Market to the original Dock Square, called Dock Square because there was a dock there. So this super scary map, which you just saw, is high tide plus 7.5 feet. It's not possible to have that flooding today. Remember, our biggest storm surge is only 6 feet. But it does say that a third of Boston, or 30% of Boston, is within 7.5 feet of today's high tide. With 2 feet of sea level rise, this becomes our flood zone. With 5 feet of sea level rise, it floods annually at this level. So a third of Boston floods annually. Salt water is so corrosive. It blows out your electrical systems. It destroys your foundations. It's very, very corrodable, or erosive. Erodible, corrosive. And so you don't actually want the city to be, even if we could pump everything out, you don't want the city to be exposed to salt water that often. So what it does say is that we have a third major investment to make after the Boston Harbor cleanup, after the big dig. Now we've got some kind of flood control that we need to do. What floods at this level? This is really our infrastructure. So Logan Airport, 6 feet above high tide. Connolly Cargo Terminal in South Boston is where all our shipping containers come in. The downtown wharfs really become submerged at that level where the aquarium is, and our neighborhoods start to flood. The city, bless them, has not been inactive. So remembering, we really started from a standing start during Sandy. So just over 4 years ago, we hadn't really done much of anything besides try to slow down climate change through carbon mitigation, but we hadn't done much about preparedness. So 2 years ago, the City of Boston came out with a climate action plan that really focused on preparedness, not just for coastal flooding, but for rainfall flooding and for heat waves. They just came out with their Climate Ready Boston, which was a citywide assessment of what's at risk, what do we do about it, and how do we merge our climate goals with our other goals, whether it's arts and culture, transportation, housing, education. And, I should have taken this out. We were going to host a global summit until Hillary Clinton lost. So we will not do that anymore. But that was in the works. But what the city is now doing is they need to institutionalize what we've learned in terms of what's at risk and what can we do about it. And so they're now working on new zoning, new budgets to basically keep ahead of climate change. So that was all kind of what's going to happen. Now we're shifting to what do we do about it? So our friends the Dutch know flooding, right? I mean, they're called the Netherlands, which is really the lowlands. And something like 70% of their people in industry is under sea level, is below sea level. So if they can do it, we can do it. So this is what they say. First, you need some kind of regional barrier. You can't have water sloshing in and out all the time. You've got to prevent chronic flooding. That could take place out in the harbor. That could be a seawall. It could even be inland. But when that barrier fails, and it will, you need some kind of transition zone. That could be a salt marsh. That could be a public plaza. Those could be playing fields. Something that can flood without harm. But then when that fails, and it will, you need to be able to batten down the hatches of individual buildings or your electrical grid or the subway so that during storm flooding, you can shut everything down, keep the water out, and then recover from that quickly and cheaply. But when that fails, and it will, you need to move. But moving can either be uphill or can be upstairs. So here's an example of a regional barrier that's been around for 30 years. This was the only idea for Boston since 1989, which is actually part of the reason we started our work to say there are other options than to put a barrier across the harbor islands. But the guy who thought of this was quite visionary. Antonio de Mambro, he's an Italian architect, and maybe even from Venice, but he's certainly friends with folks from Venice. And the idea is that you buy yourself some time by creating a barrier to do the longer term work of preparing the city. This idea of a transition zone, it can be beautiful. It could be a park, it could be salt marsh, but areas where the water can go, but when we're not flooding, we can enjoy it for other purposes. Then this idea of creating buildings expecting to flood over time, this was from a design competition we had a couple years ago where they said, hey, today the bottom floor is at ground level, once things start flooding, the second floor becomes the first floor. Right? So, you know, you can still use even a place like the inundation district, it's just you're going up. So the Dutch started working with New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and they collectively coined the idea of living with water. It's different from living in water, where you're wading through water. It's really managing water so it's beautiful and it's next to you, not in your basement, in your subway. The idea of flood resilience is let the water come in, let the water go out without harm, as opposed to resilience is keep every drop out. And there are places, whether they're hospitals or fine arts museums or your basement, where you never want water to come in. That's flood control. But flood resilience, whether it's a dock, you know, a salt marsh, a plaza, where things can flood, it's cheaper to let things flood. The way you do that is to say things that can't flood go up and then create space for the water to come in without harm. And then because this is expensive, see if you can do double duty. Can you elevate your road and it's also flood control, but you can still use it as a transportation corridor. There are even places where people build houses that are actually the berm, and then people get this nice underwater view out their windows, which are presumably extra thick. So in order to bring in great ideas and also teach our local architects and engineers about this idea of resilient design, we partnered with the city and the Boston Society of Architects. We had 50 different teams from all over the world look at a building, a neighborhood, and Morrissey Boulevard, and said, what would you do with 5 feet higher seas? How could Boston keep functioning? So here's the things we learned. First is the idea is that you don't have to armor everything today. You can phase plans over time. This is a real building, Spalding Rehab. This is actually where the marathon bombing victims went to recover. It's in Charlestown, Navy Yard. Here is their floodable transition zone, also known as the Menino Park, which is a phenomenal inclusive park. Their first floor has nothing of importance on it. There's a cafe, there's conference rooms. Their windows open, which the windows in the hospitals in New Orleans didn't open when the electricity failed, and all of their mechanicals are on the roof out of harm's way. If the electrical grid goes down, they have generators on the roof. So they're good to go really for a century, and also the front foyer, people can actually be evacuated off the top of the front foyer from the second floor. So they're good to go for 100 years. This is one of my favorite examples. This is the Chungachung Channel in Seoul, South Korea. This was, which means like beautiful water. It had the nickname of like gross, disgusting water. Before it was redeveloped, it was capped. It was an underground, dirty canal. It smelled. There's an elevated highway above it. A Korean student told me once that this was the way where you'd go to get mugged. It was just total urban blight. It was a Korean-American woman named Mikyun Kim who won a design competition to renovate about 7 miles of Chungachung Channel into really what's now like their Newbury Street or Commonwealth Avenue. It's this beautiful below-grade water element, and this is what it looks like during their rainy period. So none of the streets flood. Obviously, nobody goes down there, but it contains the water. And then in dry areas, dry times, people enjoy the channel. This is a classic example of living with water. Oh, and the idea here is create double duty solutions, where you have multiple benefits during your flood control. Design for resilience means basically prepare to fail quickly, fail cheaply. This is the Cuisinart Center for Culinary Excellence at Johnson & Wales University in Providence, Rhode Island. So they wanted a signature building for their campus. They are highly at risk of a 5-foot storm surge from their east and their west. They're right on Narragansett Bay. They don't benefit from a harbor like Boston's. And so what they did is they actually have stunt glass and stunt brick on their first floor. All that is a loading dock and conference space. All of their expensive kitchen equipment is on their 2nd through 4th floors. If they get a storm surge, it breaks the glass, breaks the brick. the water goes right underneath the rest of the building, and they clean up and move on. So this is a wonderful, and their motto was fail cheaply, fail quickly. You don't always build your way out of your problems. One of the things that we've learned from heat waves and other natural disasters is when people have social networks, people don't die, typically. Chicago had heat waves in, I want to say 1996 and 1999. It was 3 years apart, about 20 years ago. In the first heat wave, like 10 times the number of people died. It was like 700 people died versus 100 people died. I don't have the numbers right, but it was a huge difference in how many deaths they were that happened. And so part of what they did is they really did a lot of outreach between the first and second heat wave. But the other thing is the death rate in long-time established poor neighborhoods of color was, again, 1/10 of the amount of transient similar demographics in terms of economics and racial makeup. So people helped each other. It's obvious when you talk about it, but it's critical. So here's an example in England. This is called the Village Agents. This is a very rural area where about 20% of the county is over 65, and a lot of them are housebound. The government paid the neighbors to look in on their elders. During the pilot project, they had a massive flood where they got 3 months of water in 3 days, of rainwater in 3 days. None of the elders died. After the floodwaters receded, they made this permanent and also extended the program to isolated people of color. Finally, the idea that we learned was you need to institutionalize resilience. You can't make this a voluntary thing, whether it's market incentives where you align profitability with preparedness, whether there's regulations, that you can't build unless you do certain things, education, whether it's infrastructure. Here's an example in the Netherlands, and these pictures I just need to Photoshop, flip them, but they're from 180 degrees differently. That's why it's kind of confusing. It's the same place, that's the same bridge, but there's 30 places in the Netherlands where they identified pinch points in their rivers where when they had heavy rain, the water would jump the bank. And this is a 2,000-year-old city named Nijmegen, where the farmland is in the left-hand picture is where it chronically flooded. The government bought out the farmers, cut a second channel, and you can see how the water drops, the normal level of the water drops. They created this island with new retail, new residences, and new open space. And they eliminated that flood problem for Nijmegen. So that was a lot. I want you to remember 3 things. One is that unless the globe, not just Greater Boston, but the globe significantly cuts carbon emissions, Boston is very likely to see twice daily flooding of 1/3 of the city. All of our filled, we call them tidelands, by the end of the century. Because of this, whether it's 2 feet of sea level rise, whether it's 10 feet of sea level rise, it's a little bit like being hit by a car once or twice. Nothing is better, right? You don't, after a while, it doesn't really matter how high that flooding is. Boston's going to have to be different, but it doesn't have to be worse. It's going to be expensive, so we need to make every dollar count twice by solving other challenges as we deal with flood control. And again, how this is relevant to Arlington is really you're going to be dealing with freshwater flooding with more intense rainfall, probably even more so than the Mystic. You want to make sure that the Amelia Earhart pumps work really well, or that water backs up. But for Arlington, it's really about heat and rainfall. And actually, the Cambridge vulnerability assessment is more relevant, being upriver and a bit inland to Arlington than Boston's is, because we're much more concerned about the coast. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer anything. It was a little bleak. What thoughts do people have? Sure.
Sooner or later, the Amelia Earhart Dam will fail. What do we do then?
It depends how it fails, right? So if the pumps fail, but the dam is intact, my house floods in North Cambridge, right? So the whole Alewife area is dependent on those pumps continuing to work.
Yeah,
So the Mystic River, the Charles River are both very engineered rivers. And those pumps keep those rivers carefully below flood levels.
yeah.
So if the dam weren't there at all, we'd have less of a problem than if the pumps failed, right? But your question is if the dam overtops,
Yep.
that's not gonna happen until things are very different. We're good for a while. So
Oh, I agree, we're good for a while, but sooner or later, it's gonna happen.
sooner or later, Arlington should buy some Belmont, right? I mean, honestly, so if/when the Amelia Earhart Dam fails, again, if the pumps fail, then we have flooding upland. If the dam is overtopped, we have saltwater flooding from inland. But again, it's pretty far inland comparatively.
All the
It's
way
gonna
to
take-
Arlington.
Say it again? All the way to Arlington. So I guess what I would say in terms of highest priorities, if I were the Arlington town manager, I would be looking at what are the low-lying areas in Arlington that flood from intense rain or snowmelt. That's the highest priority today. And to what extent can you expand your really green infrastructure at this point is much cheaper than increasing the size of your pipes under your roads, right? Where can you expand green space to soak up that extra rain? Because we're getting in more and more intense rainfall over time, so that you have less street flooding. By the time saltwater flooding comes to Arlington, it's going to be a really different region. That's not your highest priority. The other issue is heat waves. So our normal level of hot days, I know this isn't your question, but just part of this.
I'm well aware of it, I do climate change news blog.
Great, so you're totally aware of this. So again, I only talked about the sea level rise portion of Climate Ready Boston, but they also basically said today, on average, we have 11 days a year over 90 degrees. This year, we actually had twice that. By the end of the century, we might have as many as all summer. So, for an inland city like Arlington, it's really about how do we absorb water? How do we decrease our heat island effect? Both of those are really well served by green infrastructure. More parks, more sprinkler parks, more opportunities for particularly kids, elders, people with health issues to get cool in the summer. That would be an earlier term effort. Did I answer your question? Okay.
I have a couple of questions related to sea level. One of your charts showed projections for the sea level in Boston Harbor in the future. I was wondering if you had historical data prior to 2000. How much has it changed over the past 50 or 100 years?
It's a great question. So between,
Could you repeat the question?
so how much sea level rise have we gotten so far? So between the late 1800s and the turn of this century, we had about a foot. And half of that was from land subsidence, and half of that was from climate change. And if I can borrow your piece of paper. This took me so long to figure out, like, why would our land fall post-Ice Age? But basically, the glaciers were so heavy, they sunk inland and our coastline went up, and it's still rebounding this far after the Ice Age, right? So over the course of the last century, about 6 inches of coastline. We lost about 6 inches as the coastline kept dropping way past the last Ice Age. Now that climate change is accelerating, it's less and less about land subsidence, more about sea level rise. And since the turn of this century, it's been about 4 inches. So it's actually accelerating. What we're now learning, and what's accelerating even faster, are the predictions. Because the old predictions were just based on when water's warmer, it expands. So all of the old predictions were just about thermal expansion of the ocean. Now we're learning about 2 additional things. One is people are getting a better handle on how fast land-based glaciers are melting, and that's Greenland and Antarctica, and how much water that adds. But the second thing that they've learned recently is these glaciers are so big, they exert their own magnetic or gravitational force. So Greenland pulls water towards Boston, Antarctica, being even bigger, pulls more water away from Boston. As they melt, the net sea level rise where Boston is higher. And that's a local variation. It's going to be different. So the combination of currents, thermal expansion, glacial melt, and these gravitational pulls of these big glaciers, that collective number of forces all add up to the new numbers we have. So we used to think it was 3 feet likely, 6 feet absolute, realm of possibility. Now we think it's 3.5 to 7.5 feet likely, could be as much as 10.5 feet, at the outside realm, and that's because we're getting better data. So as the data get better, our numbers are getting starker, unfortunately.
Can I just ask you one thing about the data you mentioned?
Yeah.
How high would the rise have to be now to overtop the Charles River and the Mystic River dams?
You may know the Mystic River. Charles River Dam is 6 feet above high tide, 6.5 feet above high tide. I don't know the Amelia Earhart Dam. I thought it was similar. Do you remember that number? Something similar. Yeah, and the issue is that because we're so flat, you can't just raise the dam because the water goes around. So it's really you get bigger changes at that point. Yeah. You have a question?
No, I was going to mention the thing that it's going to go around the dams before it goes over the dams.
Yeah, because the topography around it is lower.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah.
I didn't know if you knew anything more offhand, since you're obviously focused on the inner harbor and effects on Boston proper. I have a daughter who lives in Winthrop, fortunately at the top of Summit Avenue.
Well, she's fine then.
But, how those sort of barrier towns
Yeah.
will be affected. I assume they'll be treated a little more roughly
Sure.
than.
Well, let's go back to that wave. I mean, the biggest issue is storm surges. Same sea level rise, pretty similar temperatures, but it's really that it's really the waves, right? So whereas the inner harbor of Boston is less than, these are in meters, so inner harbor of Boston is less than a meter. Nahant looks like it gets it the worst, right? So Nahant looks like they would be hit with, if it's a 9 meter or about 30-foot wave. So Nahant is up here, right? Winthrop still gets some support from being, there's some friction along the coastline, so it must be a bit shallower than Nahant. But so where Nahant is going to get like a 20-foot wave, Winthrop is still down in the sort of 10 feet or less wave. Yeah, Summit Ave is a good, when you're doing real estate, think of Bellevue, for sure. Elevation starting will certainly be a premium.
Yeah, the blizzard of '78, I happened to find the old globe section that came out that year, and because it coincided with a high tide.
That's exactly it.
And in the pictures were really quite compelling.
And one of the
I wasn't born then, so.
Oh, me too. But actually, I was 11, which is the best time to have a week off from school. So, so the blizzard of '78, our winter storms. I don't understand astronomy enough to know why our tides are higher in the winter. It may just be actually, it happens to be just maybe the years in which I've been looking at this, but because the orbit of the moon changes over time. There's like a 19-year cycle. So we may just be in that cycle where our winter tides are higher. But also nor'easters happen in the winter. Hurricanes happen in the summer. Nor'easters are slower moving. You're more likely to hit the high tide in a nor'easter than a hurricane. So as our underlying sea level is higher, we're more likely to kind of get those have our storms peak. Those slow-moving peaks, we're more likely to see flooding because all of that will align more easily than rapid-moving hurricane, where we would hopefully see a peak. during low tide, not high tide. Hi. Sorry.
Given all of this, are there mandates for the buildings in Fort Point Channel and all the development that's going on at the water's edge in Boston? And if not, what are the developers doing in terms of planning?
One would hope, right?
You know?
So I would say that there's sort of 3 answers to that. The vast majority of the development in the seaport was permitted before the Great Recession and then didn't happen because of the financial crunch. Pre-2008, no one was talking about sea level rise, including us. Hurricane Sandy hit. People could have redone all of their environmental permitting and didn't. So the first buildings to go in went in as is, are not protected. Over time, they kind of looked at each other and said, what are you doing? What are you doing? And over time, the later the building, the higher the foundation. But it shows the limit of voluntary movements, because really the highest foundations are only a few feet higher than they otherwise would have needed to be under retrospective FEMA regulations, not forward-thinking climate preparedness regulations. So General Electric, coming in at a time of great awareness, they are voluntarily increasing their foundation by 4.5 feet above street level. So that's actually quite a bit. They're good to go for some time. So you got basically no change, voluntary change, and we're entering a time where the city is going to redo its zoning. Building codes are a state level change. It's kind of buried in the same place as like fire codes. It's not a place of great movement. So the city of Boston is likely to petition for a building code amendment just for the city of Boston in order to require new development and major retrofits to be flood resilient. But we're also going to need to do some kind of barrier.
And how do insurance companies view all of this?
You know, these are like absolutely the right questions, and it's surprising how much inertial friction happens. So insurance companies, they're only insuring for a single year. Today, there's very little risk. Secondary insurers are completely aware of all of this, right? And yet we have an insurance commissioner who has to authorize how much insurance premiums go up every year. So there's a downward pressure on keeping those premiums lower than the actual risk. So insurance would be the perfect market signal if it were allowed to go up as much as the risk actually is, but people balk. And in fact, there was a federal legislation a few years ago that actually was rolled back, including by Democrats from Massachusetts, because people said, I've got a cape in Situate. I can't pay $30,000 a year in flood insurance based on my risk. So insurance could be, but isn't a good market signal. Yeah, good questions. Yeah. How about high school students? Push yourself to ask questions. Yeah.
First, I have a very practical question. I can't really see Boston on that map. I'm not really familiar with
Sure.
the coastal line.
So Boston goes from this river
Yeah.
to this river. And then this is also East Boston. So this is East Boston.
Okay.
This is the Mystic River up which Arlington will find itself. And then this is Boston here. And then all of this is Boston Harbor. That includes Winthrop, Quincy, Hull, what am I missing? Weymouth. So the center part of Boston Harbor is the city of Boston, but it's not all of Boston Harbor. Yeah.
So you just said we really will need to have a barrier. So I'm curious if you showed one earlier, de novo's barrier. Do you have are there other designs out there? And is this an alive conversation in terms of the state and thinking about budgets and construction?
And federal support, right? You know, so I met with colleagues from UMass Boston and the city of Boston today, talking about an analysis we're doing together for how much that would cost. It's a long way off, and that analysis may say it's not worth it. So you can look at a barrier in multiple ways. You could have a barrier between Hull over here, and Winthrop over here that protects the entire harbor from storm surges, not from sea level rise. Once the ocean is at some level, unless you cut this off and made this into a dead lake, right? You know, it would ruin Boston Harbor ecologically if you just cut it off from the ocean. So I don't think people would do that. So you're really talking about a storm surge barrier, or a way to restrict the tide so that we don't get fully to high tide and fully to low tide. That's another thing people are talking about. But basically, you would close this when you were looking at a storm surge close to high tide. So it would buy us some time. So one option is Deer Island to Hull, but poor Hull, right, doesn't get helped by something they have to deal with, and poor Winthrop. Another option is Winthrop to Long Island to Quincy, but poor Quincy, and poor, you know, so the problem, part of the problem is the towns that have to deal with the barrier don't benefit from it. And then there's an idea of a barrier between, I keep losing my mouse, between Logan Airport and Castle Island that just protects the inner harbor, including all the liquid natural gas tanks, right? Because there's a lot of industry there. You don't want that to get flooded and cause a toxic release. So you could have a storm surge barrier here. Then there's a question, do you just want to have seawalls? Maybe that's even cheaper. Maybe if you were talking about a living with water idea, you could have what's now the Boston Harbor Walk, which is a flat walkway, elevated 6 feet, and people could be on top of it and still enjoy the view, right? So you could have a seawall. You could even, hang on one sec. You could even have the barrier on the uplands, which I don't think we'll ever do. But imagine saying, okay, flatlands, you're on your own. Right? How about a few tall buildings surrounded by salt marshes? And we're going to make our stand in the uplands. You know, there's a range of ways you could have a barrier. And we're looking at those. And it's that overlap between political viability and funding and who pays for it, who benefits, who doesn't. It's which is why it's not going to happen tomorrow. Yeah. And then next.
Do you think we need another big storm to allow people to say active? Sorry.
You're not. It's yes, right? I mean, need. So one thing that I've hoped would happen is one of the reasons why that is so true. The question is, do we need another big storm in order to act? And the answer is all of the money comes from recovery, not preparedness. The federal government will spend billions of dollars to recover, but not to prepare. And so one of the things we advocate for is a pre-recovery plan. What if everything were wiped out? What would you do? How about doing that ahead of time, right? You know, and so we can plan as if there were a storm and maybe get ahead of the storm, right? Yeah.
I know in Texas, like the houses in Texas like don't have basements and all come with a pool. And I was thinking if there are any like residential changes, especially like in Cape Cod, if there are any like residential changes that like people are thinking of doing so that houses could.
It's a great question, and you're right that, so zoning is statewide, building codes is statewide, but there are some opportunities to do local zoning overlays. It's beyond, you're nodding, it's beyond my expertise. I'm really Boston focused. But for sure, how people do architecture, whether it's required or not, does make a huge difference. So you think of Cape Cod, it's on sand. So they have incredibly erosive problems. So some of the things they do is they're putting houses on tiptoes, right? So the water goes right underneath the house. That's happening both on Plum Island and on Cape Cod. They're trying to anchor their houses so they don't get blown away, which is not a problem here. We have better bedrock. We're not built on sand. We're built on fill, but also we've got big seawalls. So you're right. Part of that building, part of the idea of resilient design is to say, what are you at risk of, and how can you avoid exposure to that risk? And if you're exposed, how can you recover cheaply and safely? Yeah. So you think about that Cuisinart Center for Culinary Excellence is the idea of, can water go underneath? Let's use this space, but make it a cheap space to use before that happens. And then, yeah, Cape Cod has tiptoes, and as you're saying, like Galveston, Texas must not have basements. And, yeah, good. I'm sorry if I called you high school students and you're college students. Where are you guys from?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah.
One of the most interesting controversies in Arlington over the past year or so has been a proposal for an affordable housing development, which is in the floodplain Bellwether Brook.
Because it's great to put poor people in harm's way, right? It's,
yeah, and
houses.
because eventually it's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And it's going to create further downstream problems. And it also avoids the opportunity to build resilience, as you've been proposing.
Yeah. So you can build affordable housing in a floodplain, but imagine starting from the second floor. So imagine having affordable housing where the whole first floor is an open, shady plaza. So people who can't afford air conditioning can get out of the sun, right? Imagine if you had outstanding mixed income, zero net energy housing in a flood zone, as long as it's legal, right? There's places you're not legally allowed to flood, but in a future flood zone where you say, hey, bring it on. We're going to anticipate this and prepare for it and make sure that we have social resilience among people, that we build, that the architecture supports community cohesion, like co-housing, instead of the Ringe Towers, which is where I live, which is, they've worked awfully hard to make a community, but despite the architecture, not because of it. So Boston, one of the things we learned is 4 of the 5 areas slated for growth are incredibly flood prone. Do you do nothing there, or you say, okay, all of these residents start way above the floodability, and below that is something that is an open air place, glassed in initially and then open air once it's regularly flooded. Yeah, imagine living over a salt marsh. It could be beautiful. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know if Boston has evacuation plans in place for this type of scenario?
Yeah.
In the flood zone.
In the flood zone,
In the flood zone, all our evacuation areas are floodable. Yep.
Yeah. So,
And Boston's like, that's definitely one of the forehead slaps. Yep. Everywhere, all of our evacuation routes are right in those pink areas. Yeah. And one of the things you see here, see this nice, guess what this blue stripe is?
It's a big deal.
Some roadway, AKA Mass Turnpike. So the Mass Turnpike becomes a corridor for flooding. Guess what this blue area? Guess what this blue area is?
That's the big
Ted Williams Tunnel entrance, right? So all of our roadways are submerged.
so we have to
And the
do
key.
evacuation or something? If they felt
It has to be redesigned. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it would have to be preemptive, and that's where you can. Oh, yes. I mean, here's one of these other cool things, inadvertent cool things. Boston has a residency requirement. If you work for the city of Boston, you have to live there. It's expensive. They don't pay much. As a result, all their leaders are now millennials. And there's this incredible new energy of really smart 30-somethings taking a totally new look at this. And it is totally inadvertent. If they paid more or other people could live elsewhere and work for Boston, they'd still have old fogies, like me. And instead, all of the new leadership are people who can afford to live in Boston, pre-parenting, and as a result, there is tremendous innovation, and they sure understand all this.
Is it a local responsibility to plan an evacuation? Like, does Arlington have to come up with its own plan? Does Medford, where I'm from,
So we
have to come up
have
with its own plan?
FEMA, Federal Emergency Management, MEMA, Massachusetts Emergency Management. I know Boston has an Office of Emergency Management, and I don't know at the town level.
There's an emergency management group.
Okay, great. As you can tell, my experience is
Is Boston.
Is Boston. Yeah.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So, one additional thing about the development that's going to be in wetlands of the Cassis, we're still fighting that, I believe. That's more pavement versus resilient land.
Could be, doesn't have to be.
I
So
know, but the plan is.
So that's what you fight, right? You know, because the Netherlands now has, like Amsterdam has the requirement that every building store its own water. There's no reason why, if this is going to go through, you wouldn't require that. There's no net gain of flooding around it. There's very straightforward ways to capture that with green roofs and storm swales and permeable pavement and, you know, community gardens. There's lots of great ways to do this. Cisterns, you know, so I think, you know, there's a whole bunch of questions. There's affordable housing, there's wetlands protection, there's flooding, you know, there's a lot of issues, and you can unpack them when you're trying to deal with how you're going to make a great town.
So you're saying it is possible to build a development without a net increase in flooding?
Oh yeah,
So the
absolutely.
opponents are trying to make the claim, you can't build in a floodplain, it's going to cause more flooding, blah, blah, blah. And they're using that as an argument against building a development. So I'm really happy to hear you say that.
So-
And say that publicly to the people around you.
I'll tell you, I've just waded into something clearly that
I
you
know,
guys
I
are
don't
you
get
know,
involved in the
I
local.
was going to tell you, don't touch that one, but
as
too late.
a Cambridge resident, what, you know, as a Cambridge resident, right? Woodlands have intrinsic value ecologically. It doesn't mean you can't build safely in them. But it does mean you have to go way up. You know, so it's you all have a range of values you need to work out. It's not the case that you can't do it. It may be the case that what's being proposed does not solve all the problems. But part of this whole idea of living with water, climate adaptation, is actually coming up with really creative solutions that solve multiple problems at the same time. I'm not saying lean in, flood, you know, build in floodplains, but I'm also saying that it's not impossible. It's really a question of how do you predict the risks and minimize them.
It's best to leave them be. Yeah.
If it's a healthy
If
wet,
they're pristine and they've been untouched, I think it's best to leave them.
I'm going to that'd be the last question. It's going to go the wrong way soon.
But
so can I just flag?
if you already built there,
Yeah, I mean,
then there's ways to improve that, you know. That's my.
you are balancing ecological, economic, you know, you're balancing a range of values, for sure, within the regulations and the social values of the town. One last question?
I would like to thank Julie for coming. We are beyond storm surge and climate change and getting into some things that Julie may not want to wade into. So I would like to have everybody express a round of applause. And thanks everybody for coming, and also thank you to ACMI for recording this for future use. So thanks again.
Thanks.